Okay, so nevertheless, good evening from Berlin to everywhere where you are. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our today's online event. We have now here, hopefully, 3 distinguished scholars as guests. I hope she will manage to join, as well as a moderator who will address the topic of Jews in the concentration camps and after liberation. This is Tori, it's her research. In general, or generally speaking, with a few exceptions, there is still no comprehensive study that conceptualizes the Holocaust in terms of the concentration camp system. In the context of the genocide of European Jews, being sent to a concentration camp or work camp meant a minimal chance of survival for Jews as they were abused as forced laborers there. Nevertheless, the death rate among Jewish concentration camp inmates was always higher than among Jewish prisoners. According to German researcher Kim Wünschmann, they were subjected to increased repression and violence even in the early camps. They were the only group of camp inmates who were collectively transferred from the concentration camps in the German sphere of influence to Auschwitz in October 1942 by order of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. The camps on Reich territory were to be free of Jews. In the Lublin district, according to Israeli Holocaust scholar David Silberklang, Jews worked for their lives, according to his study Gates of Tears, the Holocaust in the Lublin district. Holocaust historian Daniel Blattman, in his study of the death marches, showed that the death marches represented an entirely new stage in the history of the German genocide. While he noted that the death rate among Jews was not higher than that of non-Jews, he's right in that point, of course.
Hi, Boaz. Hello.
So Daniel Blattman was right that the death rate was not higher than that of non-Jews, but he failed to mention that Jews were the surviving remnant of European Jewry. In my eyes, there's still much to be done in the field of concentration camp research. There are still desiderata. A critical analysis of anti-Semitism in Le Univers concentrationnaire, the title of a study by David Rousseau, who was a survivor of Buchenwald and other camps, is still lacking. This is all the more important at a time when Holocaust is attacked and weaponized for a political agenda, minimized and distorted, and anti-Semitism is too often played down. As we all know, this is not a new development. I personally remember a few years ago standing in front of the model of the gas chambers, so of the extermination process model at Treblinka with a well-known researcher. And she explained to me that the policy of extermination against the European Jews was the same as that against the Polish people. Anyway, now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our today's moderator, Dr. Victoria von Orden-Martínez. Tori is a researcher in the Department of History at Lund University in Sweden, where she is associated with the North European Center for Research on Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. She is a non-residential fellow of the University of California Shoah Foundation and a member of the Migrant Knowledge Network of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. Her current research is centered on how survivors of Nazi persecution who were migrants and refugees after the war were involved in various socio-historical processes with a focus on gender and other differences. Victoria is currently working on a project about women survivors of Nazi persecution who were medical professionals during and after the Second World War that aims to gain insight how their wartime experiences impacted their lives and careers in medicine and science. And now, Tori, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Verena. It's very nice to be here and to moderate the seminar this evening. I actually wish it was at Western Galilee. I've been there once and had a wonderful experience, so I encourage everyone to make the journey there at some point. But this will do for now, and I look forward to hearing our hopefully three, speakers present. We're going to go in the order that is on the program this evening. Each speaker will have 20 minutes and will be followed with question and answer. This will be done for the participants through the chat. So please pose your questions, preferably at the end of the presentation so as not to disrupt, and we will address them all in form. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Susanne Barth, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. She received her PhD in history from Oldenburg University in Germany, with a dissertation that examined a forced labor camp for Jews in Blechhammer. This dissertation was awarded the pre-foundation Auschwitz Rosenberg 2021-2022 prize. Her book, From Schmelt Camp to Little Auschwitz, came out in 2024. And she closely collaborates with a Polish initiative, the Blechhammer 1944 Association, that commemorates the prisoners of Blechhammer and maintains a small museum on the camp's history. Susanne, we very much look forward to your presentation. If you'd like to share your PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, I'll try. Thank you.
Sure. And I'll be keeping track of your time, Susanne, and I'll just give you a 5-minute warning, okay?
Okay. So yeah, you already introduced my project. It's about Blechhammer. So it's important to know that the camp had two histories. One as a so-called Schmelt camp and one as an Auschwitz subcamp. The Schmelt camp phase lasted from spring 1942 until spring 1944. Schmelt camps were forced labor camps for Eastern Upper Silesian Jews that operated outside the concentration camp system. So one big difference to concentration camps was that they used civilians as camp leaders and were guarded by the German police. From April 1944 until January 1945, Blechhammer came under Auschwitz rule as its second largest subcamp. So the previous camp personnel was replaced with SS guards and camp leaders, and Jewish Auschwitz prisoners and also French resistance fighters were transferred to the camp. To better understand the creation of Schmelt camps, I will give you a brief overview of the Nazis' Germanization policies in Silesia. In 1921, the League of Nations decided to split Silesia into a Polish and a German part. So both these countries tried to win over the ethnically mixed population in the area. The Nazis pursued the strategy of Germanization through industrialization, namely to increase the numbers of Germans by creating jobs in newly built industrial plants. After the invasion of Poland in October 1939, Nazi Germany annexed the Polish parts of Silesia, the so-called Eastern Upper Silesia. It's the dark-colored areas you see on this map. The 120,000 Jews who lived there should at first be deported to the Polish-Soviet border, but as these plans did not materialize, it was decided to exploit Jewish labor in ghetto workshops and camps instead. In October 1940, Himmler installed Albrecht Schmelt, who was a high-ranking member of the SS and who had previously been the police president of Wrocław and had worked in a resettlement office for ethnic Germans as his so-called special commissioner for the deployment of foreign labor in Silesia. The so-called Schmelt office monopolized Jewish labor from then on. Heinrich Lindner, also a former policeman and member of the SS, was in charge of the camps, and another police officer called Henschel controlled the ghetto workshops. The highway company was a major client of Schmelt. Fritz Todt, who oversaw the highway company, was allocated Jewish prisoners to construct a fast-track route from Berlin to Ukraine, the thoroughfare 4, in preparation of the invasion of the Soviet Union. From 1942, the highway company took over the building supervision of armaments projects. So Todts, who had died, and his successor Albert Speer further intensified the use of Schmelt prisoners. A key figure in selecting Jewish prisoners was a civilian employee of the highway company called Hounschild, who was also known as the horse dealer among inmates. In this drawing by the Blechhammer survivor Walter Spitzer, you can see an elderly man pointing his walking stick at prisoners, who is Hounschild, and the SS man right behind him is Heinrich Lindner of the Schmelt office. Now, these are the only known portraits we have of these two, who have never really been identified. They were infamous for visiting Schmelt camps to recruit workers, but also to select prisoners for Auschwitz if they appeared not to be working well, and they killed prisoners on the spot at times. The Schmelt camp in Blechhammer was set up in March 1942 next to a synthetic fuel plant, the Oberschlesische Hydrierwerken. The construction of the plant had started in summer 1939. It was in the originally German part of Silesia, about 100 kilometers south of Opole. But they were only allocated Jewish prisoners after the highway company took over the building supervision in early 1942. So the highway company transferred Jews from their road building projects to Blechhammer. By summer 1942, there were up to 1,400 male prisoners there and some female prisoners for kitchen chores. There was a dual leadership. On the one hand, we had a police guard duty officer under the command of Lindner, and on the other, a civilian camp leader who worked for the highway company. The camp leader you see here, Erich Hoffmann, was originally a lawyer and agricultural engineer from Wrocław. He had spent 4 years in prison for criticizing the Nazi party and was excluded from all Nazi organizations and the Wehrmacht henceforth. So curiously, he was still admitted into the highway company and became a collaborator in the Holocaust, despite being an anti-Nazi. Hoffmann was notorious for his violent fits, especially when he was drunk. He killed prisoners and was permitted to participate in selections for the gas chambers of Auschwitz, and he raped young female prisoners and sent them to Auschwitz if they became pregnant. He was executed by Poland in 1948 for the crimes he committed in Blechhammer. The conditions in Blechhammer were very harsh. The food rations were irregular and smaller than in concentration camps. They did not exceed 200 to 300 grams of bread plus a bit of soup. The prisoners rarely had an opportunity to wash and wore filthy civilian clothes that were unsuitable for construction work. Body lice were common. Outbreaks of infectious diseases like dysentery and typhus occurred every summer. Jewish prisoner doctors provided medical care, but the means available to them were very limited. Schmelt camps had a very restrictive policy regarding sick inmates, so usually a completely unrealistic sick rate of no more than 2 or 3% was tolerated, when in reality about 30% of the prisoners needed medical care. Those sick for longer could be sent to Auschwitz to be gassed, or they were killed straight in the camps. There was an excessively violent police guard duty officer named Rettinghaus, who was a member of the SD. He committed brutal murders by way of water, usually by pouring cold water on the prisoners' hearts until they died, or by drowning them. The prisoners cynically nicknamed him Mikvanik, in allusion to the Jewish ritual bath mikvah. This killing technique was taught to other policemen and civilian camp leaders in a special SD school that was set up in Blechhammer in autumn 1942. After a dysentery outbreak in autumn 1942, Blechhammer lost almost 1,000 prisoners. The missing people were replaced with 600 Jewish men from Western Europe. They stemmed from the so-called coastal stops when, by order of Albert Speer, Schmelt's staff stopped deportation convoys from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in Kosel, about 80 kilometers ahead of Auschwitz, to extract 10,000 fit men. In June 1943, the Upper Silesian ghettos began to be liquidated and most inhabitants were murdered in Auschwitz. During this phase of the implementation of the final solution, Blechhammer played a great role in ghetto liquidations. Between June and August, there was an uprising of young Zionists in Sosnowitz, which had a central transit camp that was used for liquidating ghetto populations. And Blechhammer jumped into the gap when this transit camp was no longer available due to the uprising. So it established a transit camp to continue the liquidation process. There was a special barrack where families from the ghettos were separated into those fit for work and those to be killed in Auschwitz. Babies who were born in that transit camp were immediately killed. About 20 children between 12 and 16 years could be rescued by bribing camp leader Hoffman, who later formed a work detail of their own. From September, Blechhammer also took over the function of a camp for the sick. These had been introduced in the Schmelt system from late 1942, when the treatment of Jews in the Jewish hospital of Sosnowitz was prohibited. So in the beginning, such camps for the sick offered a chance to those slightly ill or malnourished to recover. However, Blechhammer merely became a collection point for unfit prisoners from other Schmelt camps who were locked into a former washroom barrack without food and medical care to wait for the next transport to Auschwitz. When the Schmelt system began to be disbanded in 1943, the sick camp in Blechhammer was also used to take about 2/3 of the prisoners of dissolved camps to Auschwitz, even if they were still fit for work. Blechhammer was taken over by Auschwitz in April 1944 and became its second largest subcamp with about 4,000 prisoners. It was among 43 Schmelt camps that were incorporated into the Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen camp systems. Blechhammer received an influx of prisoners from disbanded Schmelt camps and the last able-bodied ghetto inhabitants. So it's symbolic of the apparent paradox that the German war industry required more Jewish workers, while the final solution also reached a climax. Blechhammer soaked up Jewish workers and at the same time it took over functions in carrying out the genocide. After the takeover, all camp personnel were replaced with SS-men from Auschwitz. The camp leaders were at first Otto Brossmann and later Kurt Klipp. Brossmann threatened to have the 100 female prisoners in the camp murdered because the numbers they were tattooed belonged to other Auschwitz prisoners who were still alive. So the Jewish elder Karl Demerer you see in this photo here, he managed to save the women from being killed through bribery, and they were given new numbers. Bribery was a key survival strategy used by Demerer to gain some control over camp staff, but it was often connected to blackmail by the Germans, who even expected to be paid these sums regularly. Towards the end of 1944, the violence towards Jewish prisoners increased because of the bombing war and decrees on plundering and sabotage that permitted lynchings. A major threat was posed by the fuel plant's works police under the leadership of the company's deputy director, Heinrich Schlick. The collaboration of the industrialists and the auxiliaries reached its peak during the evacuation of Blechhammer in January 1945. So the works police shot 100 prisoners alone who refused to go on the death march. This example shows the intense complicity of perpetrators beyond the SS and how easily they could take over such tasks in the Holocaust. So to conclude, Blechhammer in both its camp phases, the Schmelt camp and the Subcamp phase, shows the large-scale involvement of different perpetrator groups, including civilians who could be transformed into accessories to murder and killers in their own right.
Thank you, Susanne, and perfect timing. Right as I was about to give you the warning, you said, and so in conclusion, I didn't even have to say anything. Thank you for this.
Just need to help me to get back to get out of my PowerPoint.
Okay, just go to stop sharing, or I can probably, I can do that. You see it? Okay,
that's
great. Okay, so now we will, I'm just reading a note. Someone unfortunately has to leave early, but they're looking forward to finishing the recording when it's available. So that's very nice to hear. We'll go ahead and take questions through the chat. And while we're waiting on some to come in, I wonder, Susanne, if you can talk a little bit. I know you worked specifically with this particular camp, Schmelt's camp, but can you talk a little bit about some of the others? How many were there? And then also, I'm very interested in hearing more about this, about Hoffman and these others who were involved, those who were anti-Nazi, but who were still committing, the same sort of atrocities and violence, following the same sort of practice. So if you could maybe elaborate on these two areas, that would be great.
Yeah, so the first question is still difficult to answer because there's new research going on. It's estimated that there were 180 Schmelt camps. And they didn't exist at the same time because especially the highway company, they had camps to finish segments of the highway and then they closed them down again. So it was like a steady coming and going of camps. Yeah, about civilians, yeah. Hoffman is a particularly extreme case, I think, where you see someone who is apparently opposed to the Nazi party and all these ideologies, but at the same time he becomes a major perpetrator and he was extremely vicious to Jews. So maybe he had some older kind of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitic attitude. He pretended he was a Catholic, so his anti-Semitism could have been based on church anti-Semitism, which was quite common in Silesia. And of course, in Silesia, you have this mixed ethnic population, the Upper Silesians or Water Poles, who were expected to turn into Germans after they had been annexed, and but they never really belonged. And so you often find it among these camp leaders that were recruited from these people that they exaggerated their allegiance and were also very frustrated in certain ways and then became very aggressive towards the Jews. And yeah, seemingly it was very easy to recruit them and also to turn them into murderers. It's shocking actually when you hear some of these stories, how ordinary people suddenly turn into such monsters. And yeah, especially this SD school in Blechhammer that was open then, it took them like 3 to 6 weeks to train normal civilians so they could make selections for Auschwitz, or they were trained in killing people through water, which was an extremely cruel process. And they apparently enjoyed it. I mean, like people like Hoffman, they picked someone every night to torture them to death. So that was his pastime. And yeah, it's there still needs to be a lot of research done about these civilians.
Combination maybe of ideology and sadism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I think that I realized that I've broken protocol. Sorry, Verena. Normally, I understand that the questions are saved to the
Everything
end.
is fine.
But so I will.
We will keep on doing it your way this time.
Okay. Thank you. I love to hear those words when people
Yes.
say, do it your way. Go ahead. It's lovely.
With pleasure.
You can do it your own way, as they say.
Yes. Okay, great. So do we have other questions for now? Or we can also come back to this in the end, because probably once we have additional,
I have a
Verena.
question.
Yeah,
Because
Verena.
when I read the book of Susanne, what I found interesting is that she introduced new perpetrator groups. Maybe you can elaborate a little on this?
Yeah, so I mentioned one group already, the civilians, and yeah, we have the police, of course, and the auxiliaries. We know quite a bit about the police in shooting squads, the Einsatzgruppen, but basically nothing about what they did in such forced labor camps. And they were also extremely brutal, and they were in charge of training these civilians, so they collaborated in these killings. And the police was pulled out of Schmelt camps in January 1943 because they were needed in other tasks of the final solution. And so by the time they were pulled out, they really had prepared the civilians for taking over. Another group that is quite neglected is the works police. That was intended to protect factories, especially during wartime and when they were connected to the armaments production. But as Nazi Germany used a lot of foreign laborers, they were also supposed to monitor these people, and they were given authority to report them to the Gestapo and interrogate them. And especially from summer 1944, we have these new decrees on plundering and sabotage, and it permitted the works policemen to kill people on the spot for like picking up something after an air raid. We have Jewish prisoners just being hanged or shot for picking up a piece of telephone wire and things like that. So I think the only research that has been done on the works police was done in the GDR. So the material that we get from there is very tainted by communist ideology in a way, and it also discredited that research a little bit, and unfortunately no one took it up again. Okay.
Great. I have a question here from Fern Hawk, who asks, were the civilians engaged voluntarily or forced to participate? Could they have refused?
Yes, they could sign up as camp leaders. It was a job offer. And they didn't have to participate because we also have camp leaders who refuse to do that, who kind of, some of these camp leaders try to mitigate the police officers' violence at times and try to help prisoners. So you didn't have to do that. And it's even more shocking to see how many of them were ready to do it and really became brutalized.
This is really fascinating research that you've done. I look forward to reading the book. And I thank you so much for all of this great, for me, so much new knowledge. So we will probably also have some additional questions at the end. We'll have time for that. But now I'd like to turn to our next speaker, and thank you again, Susanne.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Dr. Martin Clemens Winter. Hello, Martin. Martin is a postdoctoral researcher and Alfred Landecker lecturer at the Historical Department of Leipzig University with the project Corporate Culture, Forced Labor and Mass Murder at the HASAG Armaments Company from Leipzig, funded by the Alfred Landecker Foundation. Winter's... Yes, we can hear you now.
אני מדברת איתך בנייד, אני לא יכולה. בנייד שלי. לא,
She's on the phone. Okay, gonna mute her. Sorry about that interruption. Winter studied history, sociology, and communications and media science in Leipzig. His PhD thesis in English translation, Violence and Remembrance in Rural Areas, the German Population and the Death Marches, was awarded with the Stanislav Rzemecznik Research Award of the Comité International de Dachau in 2018. Winter worked in memorial sites, historical political education, and exhibition projects. From 2017 to 2020, he was project manager in the department of the Lord Mayor of the city of Leipzig. In 2020, he held a postdoctoral research grant of the Fritz Bauer Institute, Frankfurt am Main. It's a delight to have you here, Martin, and I see your presentation is already up, so we look forward to hearing you. As before, I will keep track of your time and give you a 5-minute warning.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the kind invitation and the introduction. And I also want to thank Susanne Barth for the first contribution here, because there were so many bells ringing when I heard what you said, and I think we'll have a lot of similarities or parallels in what we say. And so I look forward to discuss both of this and maybe even more together after my presentation. And yeah, in the following 20 minutes, I want to take a closer look at one of the biggest German armaments producers, which is the HASAG company. And I will also expand the view, like you, Susanne. I will also not only look at concentration camps, but also first at slave labor camps for Jews run by this company. And yeah, at first I'm going to give a short history of this company. Then I'm going to talk about the HASAG in the general government. Then I'll go to forced labor in HASAG concentration camps, and then I'll give just some slight insights into the aftermath of all of this. The HASAG, the Hugo Schneider Aktiengesellschaft, originates in a factory for metal goods founded in Leipzig in Saxony, where I'm right now here. During the Industrial Revolution, it quickly became an important exporter of petrol lamps. Then, along with the rise of National Socialism, HASAG tied itself closely to the new rulers, and the first production of armaments actually began already in 1934. Then the HASAG expanded in the middle of Germany. I'll show you a map later. And a number of branch works were erected in the area. The main product or products were all kinds of ammunition. And from 1942, the so-called Panzerfaust was developed and also produced by the HASAG. In World War II, the HASAG became one of the biggest armaments groups in Nazi Germany and as well one of the biggest profiteers of all forms of forced labor. So the HASAG engaged about 40,000 civil forced laborers from all over Europe, hundreds of prisoners of war, and then, and this is going to be in my focus today, tens of thousands of Jews in separate camps. And then in the last year of the war, about 15,000 concentration camp prisoners. As we want to focus on Jewish slave laborers today, we are today especially looking at the HASAG in the so-called Generalgouvernement, general government. And here I will present some new research also about perpetrators, also about the Werkschutz, the Werk police, or whatever the translation is. But I would also like to mention Felicia Caray here, who was not only a survivor of the HASAG camps, but also the great pioneer historian of its history. So a lot of our research today still builds on what she did research on. So immediately after the German invasion of Poland in 1939, the HASAG took over several Polish factories. Here you have them on the map, and these factories were situated in the later Radom district of the general government. At first, the HASAG became administrator for the ammunition factory in Skarżysko-Kamienna. Then it took over the granat factory in Kielce and the iron works in Częstochowa. And soon 3 more branch factories belonged to the HASAG: Pelzeri or Apparatebau, Warta, and Częstochowianka. And they were all situated in Częstochowa or Częstochow, as the Germans called it then. In early 1944, more than 26,000 people worked for the HASAG in the general government, which is the biggest number of all companies in the Radom district. But during the whole war, the permanent lack of workforce made the HASAG look for any way of recruiting manpower. So after a mass deportation of non-Jewish Polish workers in March-April 42, the HASAG began to establish its own permanent camps for Jewish slave laborers. And it is no coincidence that this happened parallel to the beginning of the Aktion Reinhardt, the Operation Reinhardt. The permanent lack of workers, enhanced by the establishment of the Generalbevollmächtigte für den Arbeitseinsatz Fritz Sauckel, the opening of the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt that tried to gain control over all Jewish labor camps in the general government, and the beginning of mass deportations of Jews to extermination camps must have moved the HASAG to tighten her access to Jewish forced laborers and thus keep them away from the sphere of the other players. On the one hand, Operation Reinhardt was a problem for the HASAG because it wanted to use the Jews as a replacement for Polish workers. At the same time, the ongoing deportations also had a positive side effects in the eyes of the HASAG, because the Jews were so desperate that they were not trying to avoid forced labor, but they tried everything to get into the camps, hoping to survive there. So the dynamics of annihilation also had pushing effects on the side of the private economy. Step by step, permanent camps were erected at all of the HASAG factories in the Generalgouvernement. And the HASAG operated an own system of camps and was the biggest private profiteer of Jewish slave labor in the whole Radom district. In May 1943, 3/4 of all more than 18,000 Jewish forced laborers worked for the HASAG. In the HASAG camps, especially in Skarżysko-Kamienna, the living and working conditions were horrifying. There was a permanent lack of essential things, clothing, food, even housing, and not a glimpse of occupational safety when working with toxic chemicals. It's important to make clear that these slave labor camps in the Generalgouvernement were no concentration camps. And in these factories and camps, it was not SS and not police who controlled the Jewish workers, but it was the HASAG and its staff itself. The participation of German employees in crimes against Jewish slave laborers went all along the HASAG staff. It ranged from involvement in the bureaucratic organization of forced labor by office clerks to deadly decisions in the upper management. HASAG employees went into the ghettos in order to recruit slave laborers for their workshops. After their arrival in the camps and during periodic body searches later on, the Jews were plundered thoroughly. In the workshops, German foremen supervised the Jews, sanctioned their behavior, and punished any action that was non-conform in their eyes. Survivors testified about everyday beatings, blackmailing, robbery, as well as sexual violence against inmates of the camps. Additionally, German managers and foremen played a crucial role in periodic selections where weak inmates were separated and shortly after murdered in mass executions. While the terror by German foremen and average workers was their sideline activity, the HASAG also engaged a special unit we already heard about today, the Werkschutz, the factory security. I forgot to show this picture, but now I want to show this one because here you have a whole unit of this Werkschutz from the Warta camp. Jewish survivor Elias Schatzkammer testified that, quote, "When going to and leaving from work, the Werkschutzmen beat us without reason whilst using rubber truncheons, logs, whips, fists and hands, and they also kicked us with their feet." Having looked at the perpetrators, now I want to focus on the inmates of the camps. The HASAG camps can be regarded as a continuation of the ghettos. Large number of inmates were taken from the ghettos. In Kielce and Częstochowa directly in the cities, and in Częstochowa the HASAG kept their Jews on their fabrics ground during deportation actions to keep this workforce for itself. In Skarżysko-Kamienna, the inmates came from the city itself and from a number of smaller towns in the area. In July 1942, the Onek Shabbat underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto recorded that 3,800 Jews had been brought to the factory at Skarżysko and that there was already a high mortality. Due to the extraordinary high mortality in the camp, especially in the notorious Camp C, HASAG had to look for new forced laborers as the Aktion Reinhardt continued and the Germans murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews. And HASAG found these workers in Majdanek, where HASAG staff selected Jewish forced laborers themselves in July 43 and brought about 2,000 of them to Skarżysko. Given the fact that there is no official documentation about this transport, we can assume that the HASAG bribed the leadership of Majdanek, which was known to be corrupt. In November 43, several thousand prisoners from the Plaszow slave labor camp were transferred to the HASAG camps officially. In 1944 followed several hundred from the Łódź ghetto and other places. And sorry, I just get to this picture. As the camps were no concentration camps, there was no uniform clothing. We can see this on the picture here. The inmates had to wear what they brought with them. Soon, most of the people wore rags, as the work and daily contact with toxic chemicals destroyed their clothing. Later, they used paper bags because of the lack of proper clothing. Regarding social structures, there was an internal hierarchy in the inmate society, and this is comparable to self-administration in concentration camps, but it is rooted in the administration of the ghettos. Lots of the functionaries of the Ordnungsdienst and the Judenrat took over important positions. And comparable to the kapos in concentration camps were the Jewish policemen. As there is no picture of policemen in Skarżysko, here you see a picture of the Jewish ghetto police in Żydłowiec, which is next to Skarżysko. In return for enforcing the HASAG's regime of violence in the camps, these policemen were allowed to have some private space, more food, access to resources, and they were spared from the murderous work in the production. In contrast to concentration camps, these HASAG camps were mixed. Men and women were together, and there were some families in the camps. Generally, these company camps were potentially more open for influx of resources from the outside. Some inmates had contact to non-Jewish Poles who brought money and valuables into the camp, and this fed an immense black market between Jews, Poles, and the HASAG, German HASAG staff, which was intermingled with blackmail and robbery by the Germans. And of course, the Jews were the ones who suffered the greatest losses, but their life was directly dependent on getting extra food, clothing, medicals, and so on. The exact number of Jews who died and were murdered in these camps is hard to determine. Felicia Carey gives an absolute minimal number of 14,000 victims in Skarżysko-Kamienna only, and we also have to add the victims of the other camps. In July 44, the Red Army approached from the east and the HASAG factories in Skarżysko and Kielce were dismantled. After a final murderous selection, the slave laborers were brought to the HASAG at Częstochowa and to the Buchenwald concentration camp. Which brings me to the next part. And here now I'm drawing on the research of Martin Schellenberg, who was the first one who dealt with these HASAG concentration camps. From 1943, the SS Wirtschaftsverwaltungshauptamt began to expand the system of concentration camps to an armament complex. Hundreds of subcamps were erected directly at production sites, and the prisoners were rented by the SS to the companies. And this approach perfectly matched with the HASAG, who had to find new ways of production and was in the need of thousands of laborers to keep the supply with ammunition stable. Thus, next to a number of HASAG factories in Germany that you can also see on the map here, subcamps were erected. The first one was at the headquarters in Leipzig in June 1944, then followed Schlieben, Altenburg, Taucha, and the latest one was Meuselwitz in October 44. These were camps for women at first, but smaller camps for men were then attached. Until September 44, all of the women's camps officially belonged to the main camp Ravensbrück, but de facto they were controlled by Buchenwald, and so in September all of these HASAG camps were officially subordinated to Buchenwald. In the end of 44, 2 more subcamps for men were erected in Kolditz and Flößberg. Altogether, about 14 to 15,000 prisoners were in these camps. The biggest one was here in Leipzig, the HASAG Leipzig camp next to the headquarters of the company with about 5,000 female prisoners. Here we have an aerial photo, and in the red area, this is the area of the concentration camp, and the other area is the production site of this HASAG and a camp for forced laborers down here. The Jewish prisoners were a large group in the prisoners' society, but there were also others. There were non-Jewish political Poles and female Soviet prisoners of war who were the first prisoners in the Leipzig camp. All in all, there were women from 18 different nations, and the camp was the biggest camp for women in the whole Buchenwald complex. The HASAG camp in Taucha, next to Leipzig, was the Buchenwald camp with the highest number of female Sinti and Roma prisoners. So when the company camps in the Generalgouvernement were dismantled in the beginning of August 1944, this Werkschutz packed a train full of Jewish forced laborers. The about 1,300 women in the rear wagons were unloaded in Leipzig, and about 1,400 men went on to Buchenwald main camp, where they received the striped clothes and prisoners' numbers. They were shaved, herded into the small camp, just to be sent further on to the Schlieben subcamp of the HASAG 2 weeks later. And these were the first big groups of Jews in these HASAG concentration camps. And it's interesting because they were very special new prisoner group, also from the perspective of the communist prisoner functionaries at Buchenwald main camp. Because these were new prisoners, but at the same time they had years of experience in German camps. They were skilled workers, relatively strong and resilient, as they had been selected positively before in Rajsko, and above all, they already had established internal own power structures in their group. And this distinguished them from other incoming bigger groups in 44, for example, the Jews from Hungary, which is also, or is the second larger group of Jewish prisoners in the HASAG camps. So those who had not immediately been murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz were sent to subcamps in the Reich, and some of them also came to HASAG camps. For example, 500 of them in Altenburg and 400 in Taucha. The male prisoners of the HASAG were mostly Jewish, but there were also other prisoner groups between them. When you read testimonies of survivors, you might be surprised about the relatively positive accounts regarding conditions in the camps. But of course, you have to put these into context, and they tell more about the places where these people had been before. Told you about the terrible conditions in Rajsko for the Jews from Poland, and the ones from Hungary just came from the ramp of Auschwitz, where their families had just been murdered right away. As the concentration camps, or as the prisoners from concentration camps were the last remaining workforce for the German industry, they had to be kept in a condition that made them fit for work. But also in the HASAG camps, there were brutal beatings, killings, and regular selections. And when we look at the relatively low numbers of death in the HASAG camps, we have to reconsider the systematic murder by so-called Rücküberstellungen, which actually means that hundreds of ill, weak, or pregnant prisoners were transferred to Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, or Bergen-Belsen in order to die there. And in these selections, the civil HASAG staff was involved again.
Martin?
Yeah.
Martin, it's time is up. Can you wrap up, please?
Okay, then I'll just shorten this, in the end, as you know, the camps were evacuated. This is also true for these HASAG camps. The survivors of the death marches were liberated in small villages in Saxony. You can see this here just after liberation in Wutzen and Waldenburg. Regarding the aftermath, I wanted to sum this up. Just two remarks. One, quite not very positive, very upsetting, and one more positive. One thing is that the HASAG building here in Leipzig of the concentration camp, the former building still exists, and today it belongs it belongs to a neo-Nazi who owns this building, and there were neo-Nazi buildings, neo-Nazi concerts and martial arts events in this building. And memory plaques have been destroyed several times. Here you can see a new memory plaque, which was erected in 2022. But there's also a memorial, which is situated on the former production site of the HASAG. It's a memorial for forced labor, where former forced laborers can come to, and school groups come to, and so on. And one last sentence is that in June this year, we are happy to welcome one survivor of the HASAG camp, who is actually the youngest survivor of Buchenwald. It's Esther Weiser from the US, and she was born in the HASAG concentration camp here just on the day of the evacuation of the camp. Her mother survived. She was born on April 13 in 1945, and we are very happy that she will come here in June and give a talk about her family's history. So you can see that this history is still very alive here. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Martin. I mean, really, 20 minutes isn't enough to hear both yours and Susanne's fascinating research. And again, I've learned so much, including that I'll save the questions for the end. But I know I certainly have some questions for you. So we'll save the questions for the end. Now I understand, because there have been some sound issues with Pnina, we're going to be listening to or watching Pnina's recorded talk. So I will do a brief introduction. And Pnina, it's lovely to have you here. I'm sorry that there are these issues. Pnina Rosenberg is an art historian specializing in the art and legacy of the Holocaust, with a particular focus on women's artistic creativity in carceral spaces and on autographic narratives produced during World War II. She has lectured on these subjects at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology in Haifa, and has presented at international conferences as well as published books and scholarly articles. Dr. Rosenberg is a research fellow at the Institute for Holocaust Research at Bar-Ilan University and serves as the art editor of PRISM, an interdisciplinary journal for Holocaust educators at Yeshiva University, New York. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Boaz, who will begin the presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the seminar, and I will present the women inmates in Rajsko subcamp. One of the outcomes of the Third Reich's motorization program was an increased demand for rubber, a need that grew even more urgent with the outbreak of the Second World War. This raw material could no longer be imported from British colonies in Eastern Asia, making it essential to intensify research into producing natural rubber. Focus turned to the coxsagis, a Kazakh dandelion whose roots contain latex and which could potentially be cultivated within the Reich's territory. Research on this plant had already begun in the spring of 1938 at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, led by Sonderführer Dr. Richard Werner Böhme. Early attempts to grow the plant in Germany were largely unsuccessful. However, with the invasion of Russia in June 1941, the project gained momentum as the plant's potential had been thoroughly studied in the Soviet Union. SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, who had a background in agronomy, took the project under his aegis. In March 1942, Himmler appointed SS Obersturmführer Joachim Caesar, who oversaw the agriculture department at the Auschwitz small village 2-3 kilometers from Auschwitz. This research unit, including the plant growing detail, focused on Coxsackie research, as well as the market garden detail, which cultivated vegetables, flowers, and cereal grains. The plant breeding unit staff, predominantly composed of female inmates, included scientists, technicians, and skilled laborers. The first to be recruited were 5 Polish scientists imprisoned at Ravensbrück, who were transferred to the unit on May 12, 1942. They were soon joined by 3 French Jewish scientists from the first convoy that left France on June 24, 1942. Among them was Claudette Bloch, a French Jewish marine biologist who became the head of the plant breeding laboratory. She was recruited by Dr. Caesar's secretary, the Czech Anna Binder. Binder, empathic to the suffering of Jewish inmates, used her position to employ many women in the plant breeding unit, offering them better living conditions and a higher chance of survival than in the main camp. As a laboratory manager, Bloch was in a position to request the transfer of qualified prisoners to the unit. Her criteria, however, were primarily humanitarian rather than based on scientific expertise, as demonstrated in Simone Frank's case. Frank, a French Jewish law student active in the resistance, had been denounced and deported to Auschwitz. In 1944, Bloch recommended her to Richard Werner Böhme, Caesar's deputy, who was then responsible for approving workers for the laboratory. Since Böhme did not know French and Frank did not speak German, Bloch interpreted Frank's answer to align with Böhme's expectations. Quote, "In this way, I saved Simone Frank's life and the lives of many others. But I was taking some risk. When they discovered that women I had qualified as special chemists were in fact shopkeepers, they got into a terrible fury." End of quote. Ironically, both the inmates and their superiors derived advantages from their roles in the camp. The inmates gained better living conditions, while the SS officers avoided deployment to the front, as their work was considered vital to the war effort. Before the Rajsko camp officially opened in July 1943, Jewish workers were moved from the overcrowded barracks to the headquarters building, from where they walked daily to Rajsko for shifts lasting 8 to 12 hours. Reflecting on the significant improved condition, Bloch contrasts the abuse and degradation she endured upon arrival with the relative privileges granted later. Quote, "Upon arriving at the camp, we were stripped, shaved, and humiliated. The process paused when Hess, the commandant, arrived to observe the first French women entering his camp. he seemed to take pleasure in the sight of those of us with red varnish on our toes. Once satisfied, we were marched to the showers and given filthy uniforms taken from deceased Russian soldiers. End of quote. After enduring weeks of exhausting labor, starvation, relentless roll calls, overcrowded barracks, and the death of many from her convoy, Bloch saw the block transfer as an outstanding event. Quote, "A miracle happened. Along with 2 other women from my convoy, we were taken to a different block to join the plant breeding unit's commando. In this block, food was distributed more civilly. We didn't have to fight for our soup. Each of us had her own bunk, and we were given stripped dress." End of quote. Quote. Eva Tischauer, a French Jew of German origin, conveyed a similar sense of appreciation. Interned in Auschwitz on September 25, 1942, she joined the plant breeding unit as a biologist and was transferred in December 1942 to the administration block. There, for the first time since her detention, she received, quote, "a hot shower and clean clothes, a stripped blue and gray outfit, and sufficient food." End of quote. Clothing became a visible marker of the women's transition from Auschwitz-Birkenau to Rajsko in 1943. Since the laboratory was frequently visited by high-ranking scientists and SS officers, Caesar wanted the women in his unit to maintain presentable appearance. As a result, they were issued outfits looted from murdered Hungarian women, sourced from Canada. The section of the camp where belongings confiscated from prisoners were stored. This transition completed a vicious cycle with a grim and cynical twist. The filthy rags once worn by Red Army prisoners of war were first replaced by stripped uniform and then by mid-1944 by dresses looted from Hungarian Jewish women, the last Jewish community in Europe to face annihilation during the Holocaust. Once the subcamp was completed, it comprised 5 barracks, 2 housing approximately 300 prisoners, and the other designated for plant breeding and gardening units. Each unit featured its own dining hall, furnished with wooden tables, benches, and chairs where prisoners ate their meals. They were provided with 3 tired bunks, fresh straw mattresses, clean blankets, and the opportunity to change clothes and bedding regularly. Each barrack also had a kitchen, toilet, and a bathhouse. As Eva Tischauer noted, quote, "The most important thing was that we were able to keep clean," end of quote. A critical necessity given the typhus epidemic that broke out in summer 1942 that also affected the SS officer Caesar and his wife, who ultimately died. Following his recovery, Joachim Caesar took significant steps to improve hygiene for the plant breeding inmates who regularly interacted with German scientists during the work. Quote, "Compared to the normal workforce, we were cheap and we increased the wealth of the SS who ran all the camps dedicated to the final solution. We were exploited slaves. They will got no short of hands or brains. They arrive every day from all over Europe. They have total control over our working condition. They fear neither strikes nor sick leaves. Even our death means nothing to them. We are immediately replaceable. But we shall resist by surviving, and sabotaging. End of quote. These words written by Eva Tischauer reflect the vulnerability of the privileged forced laborers who, as defined by Primo Levi, acted in a gray zone, a space where inmates faced choiceless choices involving a form of complicity with their oppressors under the pressure of survival. The privileged status of Rajsko inmates came with constant and fatal uncertainty, as their position offered no guarantee of safety. They lived in perpetual fear of being transferred to the main camp for illness or even minor infractions, a move that often meant a direct pass to the gas chambers. Tischauer observed that, quote, even if we are chosen for our gray matter, we are not protected against death, which continues to keep an eye on us, end of quote. And Claudette Bloch added, quote, we were always living on the edge of a knife. It was sufficient to be found out with a smuggled onion or a carrot to be sent back to Birkenau. A friend of mine sent like that to Birkenau. I was caught with a cucumber, but Caesar was so keen on keeping me, so he transformed it into digging the latrines of the SS for a whole Sunday. Another privileged inmate who narrowly escaped a similar fate was the French chemist Bert Falk. On July 14, an imaginative text she had written about the impending liberation of Paris was discovered by an SS guard. Falk avoided execution due to her assistance with the doctoral dissertation of Ruth Weissman Caesar, the new wife of Joachim Caesar. Instead of facing execution, Falk was assigned to a punishment detail for 6 months, where she continued working on Ruth Caesar's research on the latex content of Coxsackie's roots. Tragically, the Slovak Jewish draftswoman Lili Toffler received no such immunity. After a letter she attempted to smuggle to a male inmate with whom she was in love was discovered, she was transferred to the main camp. On September 21, 1943, following an interrogation involving severe physical and psychological torture intended to extract the addressee's name, a demand she resisted, she was shot twice by SS officer Wilhelm Boger. Alongside their official tasks, the inmates also engaged in clandestine cultural activity. This was poignantly expressed in the Christmas evenings they secretly organized, an event that was intertwined nostalgic memories with an aching longing for freedom. Their performances offered a fleeting escape from captivity, though shadowed by reality, as vividly recalled by inmates. Quote, the curtain rises, the Czech Annie Binder stands on stage. As she speaks of Prague, her blue eyes shine, and her voice resonates with emotion. End of quote. She gestured toward a drawing of Prague created by a fellow inmate, quote, who with just a few pencil strokes succeeded in bringing the city to life for us. End of quote. Next came Claudette Bloch performing a scene from Cyrano de Bergerac, followed by Raya Kagan dancing beside 2 inmates who sang softly. This evening culminated in a moment both tender and harrowing. Quote, suddenly a young woman appears on stage, mimicking the chimes of midnight. Bim bam, bim bam. And then adds in a soft, barely audible voice, freedom, freedom, come quickly. and set us free. We are waiting for you, waiting. Words without rhyme. They capture the heart and express our longing, yet they also break the illusion and return us to reality. Quietly, quietly, we return to our bunks. End of quote. The midnight bells ruptured the spell. The illusion dissolved, and the prisoners were jolted back into their grim reality. This fleeting moment of theatrical escape, an interplay between imaginative freedom and the harsh confines of captivity, so often reflected in carceral art, offers a poignant glimpse into the inner world of the incarcerated. In this fragile space between illusion and reality, through performance and artistic expressions, they reclaimed not only a measure of solace and resilience, but also a quiet assertion of self amid the relentless forces of dehumanization. The research results were far from impressive. Caesar lacked expertise in the field, relying heavily on his staff. Dr. Böhme, who had conducted research in Germany and England, quickly realized after arriving in Auschwitz that the prisoners were not engaged in a serious research. He watched them suspiciously, eager to prove sabotage. Böhme pointed out Claudette Bloch as responsible for the poor outcomes, as she attested. Quote, naturally, he blamed me for the mediocrity of the results and developed a strong dislike for me. Due to his hatred for someone with a background similar to him, at every opportunity he reminded me of my prisoner status, while he remained one of the masters. End of quote. On January 18, 1945, with the Red Army approaching the subcamp was evacuated and the inmates were forced to begin a death march westward. Survivors frequently credited their survival to their transfer to Rajsko. As Tisha later reflected, quote, I still like dandelions. They saved my life. I respect this bright yellow flower. I blow the winged seeds away so they will multiply. End of quote. This evocative image of dandelions, both resilient and regenerative, encapsulates the paradox of life preserved amid systems designed for destruction. I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pnina. Don't know if you can hear me, but thank you. So we now have, I believe, about 10 to 15 minutes for questions for everyone. So if you have questions, please put them in the meeting chat and I will read them out. I'll take the moderator's privilege, of course, and I'd like to go back to Martin and address, just see if you can maybe talk a little bit more, Martin. I found it very interesting when you said that the HASAG wanted to replace Polish workers with Jews. So can you talk about this a little bit more, about why and what it meant? I'd love to hear you elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. So as I tried to sketch out, there was always a big need of all forms of forced laborers, and the HASAG had the opportunity to use, in quote, their non-Jewish Polish laborers for the factories in Germany, which was different from other companies, especially in Leipzig, who had problems to get foreign forced laborers to here in the first months, but the HASAG was very early because they had these production sites there and had access to bigger groups of non-Jewish Polish laborers who were in several bigger actions deported to Leipzig and other places, and then there was a need, of course, for workforce in the general government. And on the other hand, as especially Felicia Karay tries to sketch out, it was also a question of that the HASAG had the idea, or maybe it's also some kind of true, that there was a big issue of absenteeism with the Polish laborers, with the non-Jewish Polish laborers. So they were not in camps at these sites in the general government. So they just walked in from their private homes and they just stayed away from work because they had to, in order to survive, they had to go to the black market and get some extra stuff there. And if you go to the black market, you can't go to the HASAG and produce ammunition. And so the HASAG had the idea that they should try to put more force onto their laborers, and this was possible with the Jews, but at the same time it was not possible with the civil Polish people there, and so they had the idea to use the Jews as a workforce.
Thank you for that. We have a question in the chat, or question from Caroline Slifkin to everyone. She's asking, was the movement of inmates to and from the camp systems? What was the survival rate like, and difference maybe between the genders? Martin, do you want to take that one first? You're kind of...
Not really. I have to say I cannot give any numbers or survival rates or like this because, or maybe one sentence about this. The problem is between the camp systems that we have regarding these company camps. We have very low documentation, so it's very fragmentary what was recorded. And so we have no exact numbers, how many people were there, who were these people. So it's just very raw estimation when we, so Felicia Karay, she looks at the communities where the people came from, the ghettos, where we have some numbers. And, but yeah, it's really fragmentary, so it's hard to give numbers about this.
Okay, Susanne, do you have anything to add on to that?
About death rates, I don't have precise figures for the women in Blechhammer, but for the men, especially for Dutch prisoners, we have about 95%, and it varied a little. So the Dutch had the highest, and the women only spend a very short time in Blechhammer, so it's hard to trace them back.
A follow-up question, and I think this is for you, Martin. Fern says the HASAG needed laborers as you described, but they made no effort to keep them healthy. Was this because of the steady stream or brutality?
Yeah, actually there were different phases. In the first phase, when there were still a lot of people available to them, they made no effort to keep them healthy. But later on, when the Aktion Reinhardt continued and more people were murdered, and the HASAG realized that there were less people available, then they also changed a little bit the conditions in the camp. There was a little bit more food, a little bit better housing in some kind of way. So you can see that there this kind of rationality begins to rise when they have less access to human workforce.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Susanne, I think that In your case, this wouldn't apply because it shut down earlier. Is that correct? So they didn't have the contingency so much to keep the inmates healthy because they were finished earlier. They closed down the operations sooner. Is that correct?
Yes, they didn't make any effort. Well, this policy was introduced in 43, so this is still a Schmelt camp phase, and they did take on some things from Auschwitz, but not all of them, and so they were pretty free to do what they wanted, and they certainly didn't increase the food rations then, and even when they were taken over by Auschwitz, well, it increased for a little bit. The survivors always say Auschwitz was better than the Schmelt system because they had a little more food, but it didn't make such a huge difference. And especially in 44, the death rates were extremely high because they had to work so much building air raid shelters and things like that. So they had an extreme mortality all the way.
And as we saw in Pnina's case, of course, they were treated relatively well because they were valuable, they were needed, they needed to keep them for show as well, from what it sounded like. So we have really rather three different scenarios here of how they're keeping the prisoners and the kind of treatment that they're getting, which makes it quite an interesting juxtaposition. I find this in my own research quite interesting when I'm looking at different at testimonies. When they're moving around to camps, they're always commenting on, well, we got a little more food here, there was less lice here, these kinds of comparisons that, that there was no consistency, even among the camps, never mind these sites that were controlled by different organizations or civilians, so forth. So I think this is an interesting an interesting finding from the three presentations we've heard today. We can draw this out. I want to say as well, in addition to the variations in conditions that you all highlight through your talks, for me, it's very enlightening. Because when I'm looking for these subcamps, when I'm trying to find out more information from the testimonies that I work with, I do the research to try and find more information about subcamps, about labor camps. And Martin, you mentioned one. I have at least one woman who was in one of the HASAG sites. It's very hard to find dedicated research on many of these sites. I mean, there were so many, and it goes back to what Verena was talking about in the beginning. We don't have anything comprehensive for sure, but in many cases we have very, very little, if anything, on some of these subcamps, labor camps, and this is very, very frustrating. So it's wonderful to see that you all are focusing on these camps to start building up an understanding, or these labor camps, work camps, all the different scenarios, so that we can start getting a better picture and understanding the complexities of the systems. Can you talk a little bit about, each of you, maybe about why you chose to write about these particular contexts? Susanne, maybe you can start with yours, because I mean, I have never heard of the Schmelt camps ever.
It was the same with me. I got into the subject because of a family history, because my great-grandfather, who was taken to Auschwitz and then got a chance to work on construction sites near Blechhammer. And I just got interested in his history, and then I started to write my dissertation on Blechhammer, and of course on the camp for Jews mainly. And then it took me some time to figure out what this was all about, and the two different camps that were there. And yeah, it's very complicated and not very well known, but there is literature, and actually Polish research on Schmelt camps started in 1946 already. And it took an awfully long time for this research to come from Poland to Western Europe and other parts of the world. And there's no commemoration. That's also a part of the problem, that people are not familiar with these camps.
But if you
Martin?
read, may I add something?
Yeah, of course.
So if you are interested, there is a quite very good PhD thesis by Andrea Rudolph. She worked because the Schmelt camps, many of them were turned into concentration camp subcamps. And it's interesting because the inmates were, these were the first selections because the trains were stopped from, I don't remember, from the Schmelt camps to Auschwitz, and these were the first selections. People were selected on their train to Auschwitz, as far as I remember it right. I can send this to you if you like.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. And Martin, yeah, do you have something to add about how you came to this topic? And I mean, because it really is, you can take it in scales, can't you? You can take this, and you probably do and have take it in scales and you know, large, small, everything in between.
Yeah, yeah. I just at the end of my lecture, I mentioned this memorial, and I'm engaged at the memorial for some years now with a group of people who want to do something about local history here, and so right now in Leipzig, this HASAG company, and it was that big, is quite known at people, but for lots of people, this is a Leipzig thing. They have in their minds, okay, the HASAG was here in Leipzig, and then they were in Altenburg, which is next to here, and they had some other sites. But this whole thing in the general government is really not well known here, and so I think it's important to put this on the map here, that our city has also this transnational history of mass crimes and complexity and connection to the Holocaust. And I'm researching this HASAG company from the idea that this company was really big, and they have a very strong ideologized Nazi corporate culture on the one hand for the German workers there. Yeah, you have magazines and stuff like this with all this propaganda. You have the concerts playing at the production site and stuff like this. And on the other hand, you have what I just told you today, these mass crimes and this forced labor history and all forms of forced laborers, tens of thousands of people who were brought here and had to work for this company. And I want to bring this together, to look at this from the idea, okay, so how does this work together, and what does it tell us about maybe when you say about scaling it up, about how National Socialism worked with inclusion and exclusion. So meaning to include the Germans who worked there by at the same time excluding all the forced laborers, and also, of course, the Jewish forced laborers at the same time. And so this is the approach to look at this complexity on the example of this one company.
Sorry, I had trouble getting to my unmute button. Right, that's fascinating. Thank you for elaborating on that. I think there's so much potential in all of your projects and further research on them, and I really look forward to following and hearing more about what all of you are doing. And I think this has been a very interesting panel. The presentations together are great on their own, but together they make for an even more interesting and varied analysis. So thank you all so much. We have no further questions in the chat. Verena, did you want to add something, close up? How do you want to?
So I open, so I suggest Boaz, you close. You are unmuted.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Pnina, for giving us the recording so that we could hear you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Susanne. I learned a lot. And I was just thinking that this putting all these together under the title of Jewish prisoners in the camps tells us several, opens several avenues of thought. First, you can't really separate between the prisoners and the system. You can't talk only about the prisoners, because the prisoners are prisoners of a system, and the system is very important. We saw today 3 different systems of subjugation and exploitation of Jewish prisoners. So the different systems influence the whole story. You just can't tell it as a story only about people in hell, because the hell here is an organized system of exploitation, which is different, like you have shown, which is very important, really, all of you. And it opens also the issue, of course, when we talk about money-making systems. I don't want to say capitalism. We talk about big conglomerates where the bottom line is the sum earned by the company. This is what it is really. What is on the last line of the budget? What is the result of the budget? How much money did the business make? We see here how scientific business concerns influence the exploitation of the prisoners. Of course, we are still left with the question on how do they do, if they really want results, if they want good financial results, why do they not take care of the prisoners? We still have this question, will always go when we talk about concentration camps, and of course the answer is ideological. But I think this is a very important question. Also, the whole idea of the financial motives here in exploiting and building business conglomerates or scientific endeavors who make money for the German war effort and for people personally, for their pockets. So I think this is an issue that we also have to look at. Anyway, it was important for Verena and myself to do an event on the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Today we are so much busy, we hear so much, everything is like amorphous. There's a dejudaization of the Holocaust. This is something about genocide and racism and big nice words, just trying to get the Jews out of the Holocaust. It's much more convenient. So it was important for us to do this. And then we have several events in the line, but one of the next ones is about Jewish children. So we are interested in bringing the Jews back into Holocaust research. We think this should be reawakened in the sense of the discourse that we hear today about and the comparisons we hear running today. So I think this is important. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you, Tori, for moderating so nicely. And of course, we'll put the recording up and we'll try to get it out as much as possible. So thank you very much and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.